Dr. Steve Lennox is the professor that I had in university, which is amazing because we're the same age. I don't understand. But no, he had just finished his PhD at Druze, and I had him for his very first year as a professor. And so what that meant is everything he learned in his PhD program, he tried to teach us in a semester. And hardest class I've ever had. But I developed an incredible appreciation for his love for God, his love for people, and his knowledge of the Word of God. And so it is our joy to be able to prepare this trip together, that we will be heading to Israel in March. And this will not be our first time together. The very first time we went to Israel together, Tracy was 8 months pregnant. And so we packed a baby's outfit in the suitcase and almost had a Jerusalem baby. And Dr. Steve Lennox was on that trip. And so he just reminded us regularly, hey guys, if you do go into labor, I am not that kind of doctor. And but he's the kind of doctor that will help us learn a lot about God's Word today. So would you welcome our good friend from Kingswood University, President Dr. Steve Lennox.
Thanks, Joe. Well, thank you, and thanks for being here today. Let me just say, first of all, don't try to write everything down. In fact, maybe you don't need to write anything down. I'll make the PowerPoint available. The videos will be available. I can share my notes with you. I want you to absorb and not exhaust yourself. So just relax and listen and participate. We'll be having time for questions. As Pastor Joel mentioned, we'll do this in 20-minute chunks and pause then for a time of question and answer. And Pastor Joel will help me with that as well. How many of you like the show American Pickers? Visiting Israel is kind of like watching American Pickers or Canadian Pickers. It's filled with treasures. But the picture that you're going to see when you land in Israel, and I'm going to talk as if everybody's going because I believe everybody will go sooner or later. It's a great place to be. But the picture that you see when you get to Israel is not like the one on that side. It's more like the one on that side, where it feels like you're coming into a room and things have just been piled all akimbo, and there's just no way to sort it out. Pastor Joel mentioned that when you go to Israel, you feel like you're drinking from a fire hose, and this is part of the reason. There's so much to see, but it's not all neatly arranged by chronological sequence or biblical passage. It's all jumbled together. Now, Mike and Frank can go into the room on either side and tell you what you're seeing. My goal for this morning is to help to equip us to be a lot more like Mike and Frank, to be able to work our way through what really seems to be a jumble of treasures and sort them out chronologically, sort them out in terms of value, sort them out in terms of political significance, religious significance, biblical significance. So you and I are going to work together to kind of orient ourselves to this whole beautiful experience that we call Israel. So we're going to start really as if we're landing on the ground, the kinds of things we're going to see when we get to modern Israel. Then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the history, starting with biblical Israel, working our way up to the present. And then we'll be talking about some issues that relate to just, is Israel God's chosen people still? They were. Are they still? And what does that mean? And believe it or not, that's a real live question that has religious and political implications. And I just thought you and I should talk about that for a few minutes. And then we'll spend some time actually going on the tour. Now, for those of us who are going, this is pretty much what we're going to see in the order in which we're going to see it. For those of you who've already been or will be going, you'll find that most tours follow a sequence geographically pretty much similar, where you land in Tel Aviv and then you make your way to Jerusalem and then back to Tel Aviv. So that's the way we're going to talk through it. So if you're going in March, this is what you'll be experiencing, and if you're going some other time or have been, it'll bring back memories or prepare you. And then we're going to finish up. Our last little sequence is going to be, what do I need to know? If I'm going to go to Israel either this time or in the future, what do I need to know in order to be well prepared? So that's a bit of an overview for the morning. So let's start with a little bit about modern Israel. This is a tiny country. If you're from the States, it's about the size of New Jersey. It's a little bit more than 20,000 square kilometers, which means that you could fit Israel twice into Nova Scotia and 3 times into New Brunswick. So it's a small country. But there's 9 million people, give or take, in Israel, about 3/4 of whom are Jewish. And we'll talk specifically about the different kinds of Judaism that we find there today. But about 6.5 million or so of the current population of Israel is Jewish. And then there are others, Arab Muslims, who are actually Israeli citizens. Not all the Arabs who live in that area are Israeli citizens, but there's about 1.5 million that are. Among those Arab citizens are a group that we will see known as Bedouins. This is a nomadic group. Now, there's some tension. By nomadic, I mean they wander around with their sheep and their goats and their tents to various parts of the country. But Israel is trying to help them get settled because it's much easier to provide for them and for them to provide for themselves if they're settled. But we will see tents, Bedouin tents, especially as we travel from Jerusalem down to the Dead Sea or from the Dead Sea to Jerusalem. These are semi-nomadic. Their main livelihood is raising livestock, and they are incredibly hospitable. As we drive by those tents, I don't know if we'll have time, but we have done it. Maybe on the trip that Pastor Joel and Tracy took with us, but we have stopped and actually gone in. They are incredibly hospitable. And so the saying is, he who shares my bread and salt is not my enemy. About 170,000 of these, especially down in the Judean wilderness and then elsewhere. There's also a group that we will see known as Druze. Now, these are not Jews, and these are not Muslims, and they're not Christians. It's a splinter group off of Islam, and they're recognizable. We'll see them when we get up around Mount Carmel, especially. But they're especially recognizable for their head coverings, their white head coverings, and their mustaches. I'm talking about the men. I don't know about the women's mustaches. People know very little about their beliefs. They don't have the practice of catechizing. They keep their beliefs very secret. And so I'm told that they believe in reincarnation, but who knows? There is this group. They are loyal Israelis. They fight in the military, and they're about 140-some thousand. So you've got your Jews, about 3/4. You've got your Arab Muslims, about 18%, including the Bedouins. You've got your Druze at about 1.5%. And then you've got Arab Christians at about 2%, or give or take 180,000. And then there are other, about 4% of others. So about 9 million people in this little country, half the size of Nova Scotia. 2 official languages, Hebrew and Arabic. And I've given you an example of both. This is modern Hebrew, which is distinct from biblical Hebrew. Nobody speaks biblical Hebrew anymore. It's a dead language. But about 150 years ago, as there was this increasing determination for the Jews to reestablish a homeland, they knew they needed to have a language. And so they actually created one. They took what they knew of biblical Hebrew. They took what they knew of Yiddish, which is a form of Hebrew spoken in Europe. And then if they didn't have words in biblical Hebrew or Yiddish, they took the English word and just translated it into Hebrew characters. So the Hebrew word for telephone is telephone. The Hebrew word for Coca-Cola is Coca-Cola. So these aren't words that come out of the Bible, so they had to have them borrowed from English. So modern Hebrew is the language that's spoken there, but so is Arabic. Arabic is a similar language to Hebrew. It's a Semitic language. Some of the words, I call them cousins in terms of language. Some of the words are very similar. So, for example, the word for heart in Hebrew is lave. The word in Arabic is leave. The word for pilgrimage in Arabic is hajj. And the word for festival or pilgrimage in Hebrew is hajj. So there are similarities in the two languages, although a very different alphabet, as you can see. As far as the government goes, it is a parliamentary democracy. There is a president, but the president really is apolitical. It's much more ceremonial. The real power leader in the country is the prime minister. Anybody know who the prime minister of Israel is? Benjamin Netanyahu. They also call him Bibi. He is the longest serving prime minister in Israel. He was in office from 1996 to 1999, and then he came back in 2009, and he's serving to the present, but who knows for how long. He's been indicted on corruption charges, and so there is an election that's going to be taking place. We will arrive on March 3rd. The election will take place on March 2nd. So it may come up in a conversation with a bus driver or a taxi cab driver. Netanyahu is part of the Likud party, which is the right-wing party, and that's where his support comes from, a kind of hard line against the Palestinians. And as I said, indicted on bribery, fraud, breach of trust, and the jury is still out on exactly how all that's going to shake out. Whether he can continue to serve as prime minister while he's being tried, we'll learn more as we get closer. The legislative power is in a group of 120 elected officials who are part of what's known as the Knesset. And the legislative headquarters is in Jerusalem, not far from the Israeli Museum, which we're going to see. As far as the economy goes, this is a very highly developed economy. So you've heard of developing nations or third world nations or fourth world nations. Israel is a first world nation. The United Nations considers Israel a very highly developed country. It has a higher standard of living than many Western countries. It's famous for high tech. It's been called the Silicon Valley of the Middle East. It's a startup nation. They're famous for their entrepreneurship. It's a scientific powerhouse. It's the fourth in the world in scientific activity. Now, we're talking about a country that's half the size of Nova Scotia, 9 million people. The percentage of scientists per 10,000 in the United States is 85. 85 scientists per 10,000 in the United States. In Israel, scientists and technicians, in Israel, it's 140. So very, very, very oriented to high tech and to science. It's also, part of its economy is industrial manufacturing, although it has no reservoirs of oil. Golda Meir, who was a prime minister of Israel back 30, 40 years ago, is famous for saying, "Let me tell you something that we Israelites have against Moses. He took us 40 years through the desert in order to bring us to this one spot in the Middle East that has no oil." But there have been, off the coast in the Mediterranean, recently been discovered large reservoirs of natural gas. So we'll see what happens there. Tourism is, of course, another industry that drives the economy of Israel. 3.6 million tourists last year. In a population of 9 million, half the size of Nova Scotia, more than 1/3 additional shows up. 3.6 million. That's a 25% growth since 2016, and a record-breaking 20 billion of their new Israeli shekels, which would be about 5 billion US, fed into the economy. So this is a huge part. Now, I mentioned this partly because it's impressive, but also because you're naturally wondering about security as a tourist. And we'll talk more about that in specific, but just to let you know, this is we as tourists are an important part of the economy of Israel. So you might imagine that they look after us pretty well. We'll talk more about that when we get closer. I want to say a word or two about religion, but I'll come back to that. I thought it might be helpful just to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that the Israelis face. And I think I've identified 4 that are significant challenges for this little powerhouse of a country. One of them, surprisingly, is water. This isn't like Egypt that has a naturally occurring supply of water. And so in addition to a drought that they've been struggling with for a while, there is an increased demand because of population growth. And so water is in high demand. The rising standard of living has influenced that, and so they're doing a couple of things to try to address the situation. One of them is desalinization. They have lots of salt water, and so they're investing heavily in desalinating that water to use it. And they're also developing a pipeline from Turkey, which is to the north and west, and bringing the water down from there, where there's plenty of it, down into the country. But water is one of the things, and we'll talk more about that when we get a little further on this morning. A second threat is security. If you've been following the news, you know that the United States government assassinated an Iranian official who was in Iraq, and immediately the Iranians began to talk about bombing Israel. This gives you some sense of the vulnerability of this little country. It is the target for lots of nations, Iran perhaps at the head of the list, but Israel has lots of enemies from outside. And then there is the threat of security from inside, from the Palestinians. I'll say more about that in a minute. Israel has a mandatory draft, and you and I are going to see lots of soldiers with their automatic rifles over their shoulders. Everywhere we go, they're going to be getting on the bus. Sometimes, you'll see them getting on the public transportation. You'll see them standing around. They're a ubiquitous feature of Israeli society, and this is a good thing because security is so important to the Israelis. Global anti-Semitism is a third problem. Now, if you know history, you know that anti-Semitism is not a recent phenomenon. The Jews have struggled for the entirety of their existence with the animosity of other people groups against them. There really has never been a time period where the Jews were a most favored nation by the rest of the world. And so the Jews have always had to struggle with this kind of anti-Semitism. But it's a different story now when you have rockets trained at your country and where you have bombings of synagogues and knife attacks of synagogue services. Our son is dating a young woman who's Jewish. They live in Pittsburgh. And if you were following the news, you know that there was a shooting in a synagogue not far from their home, not where she attends, but not far from their home. And I can tell you that it was a very moving experience for my wife and me to visit the shrine that had been established there on the sidewalk outside this synagogue. And it's hit home to us to realize that people are trying to kill people like my son's girlfriend just because of her religion and her race. This is a threat to the Israelis, and you and I won't understand what's going on with Israel unless we understand this kind of anti-Semitism, which is pervasive. And then the fourth threat is the Israeli-Palestinian relations, and I'll spend some time talking about that specifically a little later on.